We're now into week 11 of our subject, and we're looking this week at queer economics. Just as we've done in previous weeks, we're going to begin with the historical context and the problems that the queer economists conceptualize themselves as facing. We'll look at, in particular, how theories of gendered injustice proposed by the early founders of feminist economics in the late 1980s and 1990s obscured the social problems experienced by families of non-traditional organisation and of diverse gender identification. And that became the problem that the queer economists shouldered. And in this historical context, the problem, if you like, became how to respond to the fiction of binary gender and purportedly essentialist dimorphic biological difference. And having problematized this fiction and having shown that it led to methodologies and consequently theories of families and of injustice that obscured experiences of non-traditional organisation and diverse gender identification, we will then look at the methodologies proposed to respond. So the response, here we turn to Lee Badgett, who was a really key figure in the development of queer economics. In fact, Lee Badgett is the outgoing president now of the International Association for Feminist Economics. And since the mid-1990s, she's done a lot to progress a research agenda that moves beyond some of the initial concerns of the early founders of feminist economics. Key elements of Badgett's methodology include strategic essentialism, and we'll discuss what that means when we turn to the methodology section, attention to exclusion in an ongoing way, and Badgett also tries to retain that attention with respect to her own work too, which I find very interesting. Deference to activism and identification of actionable research priorities for rainbow families. So those are the key elements that we'll discuss shortly. And then we'll turn to critical considerations as we do each week. We'll ask who wins, who loses, does it matter? So in part one, I'm going to look at historical context, tracking this really back to the late 1980s and early 1990s, where the emergence of feminist economics in disciplinary economics became viewed by Lee Badgett and others working within that subdiscipline of feminist economics as able to be improved by more inclusive categories. I'm going to abstract this discussion, this historical context and the perceived problems that were shouldered by the queer economists from two early articles by Lee Badgett. And I'm going to support the discussion of this historical context with work that's listed in the references by other economists inspired by European philosophy, literary studies, cultural studies, and the like, where feminism took quite different form to the sort of gender feminism that defined the second wave broadly and contested, as we've seen in our potted history prior to this, the sort of feminism that had defined second wave feminism. So the readings for you this week that are required readings are two readings by Lee Badgett from the mid-1990s. And I've also popped some additional recommended readings from our reader. So we're going to return to some of the material from Feminist Economics back in the early part of this subject, and recall how the early founders of feminist economics conceptualized their historical problem, and why this conceptualization led in turn to forms of blindness with respect to other injustices that were experienced. We saw how it took a very long time for liberal versions of gender feminism to force their way into the discipline of economics. And we discussed a number of reasons for this in week 6, noting just how much effort it took to secure disciplinary change in economics. And we noted back then, in the early week in our subject, that it was that much harder in economics to secure change. Feminism had already been included in very many disciplines: philosophy, sociology, literary studies, cultural studies. A whole range of disciplines and subdisciplines and area studies had already been heavily influenced by feminism by the late 80s and late 1990s, in the 1990s, but it took that much more effort to secure disciplinary change in economics. So the arrival of feminism to economics was really quite late, comparatively speaking, and that shows something specific about economics too, in relation to, in comparison to other disciplines of study. We noted back in the week on Feminist Economics that we kind of tracked, we provided our own history. And this is a history that I've provided myself in my book in a way too, which really shows how in stage 1 there really did exist early forms of feminism in economics in the 19th century. Although they became increasingly to be viewed by the discipline of economics as not economics per se. We saw that activist economic thinkers had quite interesting accounts of the family, labour, ideals of cooperative organisation of domestic labour in socialist utopian societies. And this was a real characteristic of the late 1880s, really up to 1918. In stage 2, we noted how the First World War, even though the First World War had really relied on moderate feminist organisations to assist because women had replaced men in factories, after the war we saw a turn against feminism and against feminist economic thinking. These activist organisations, in the US at least, became red listed. These were moderate feminist social organisations, including the American Home Economics Association, that were viewed by the US government as potentially communistic, and activist feminism became marginalised in economic thinking from the end of the First World War onwards. And we see that from about in this interwar period and just after the Second World War, what I've referred to in my book as the old household and consumer family economics was really very much about how traditional families in traditional gendered roles could improve their consumption. So materialist, activist, feminist thinking, the sort of thinking that really was a characteristic of 19th century economic thought disappeared in this interwar period and became replaced by concerns with how to improve traditional families with traditional gendered roles, improve the livelihoods. And that, of course, was an important thing to be studying, given the Great Depression, given the out-migration of poor families from the Dust Bowl areas, which heightened poverty during the 1930s and 40s. So we saw that this really was a valuable and important contribution, but it could no longer be counted as feminist according to the activist materialist conceptions of economic thought that had previously been explored prior to this period. And there were many reasons for this that we tracked ourselves in that week where we studied feminist economics. We also noticed in this second stage, where we saw a demise of activist materialist feminist economic thinking during this interwar and post-war period, we noticed how the new household economics of Gary Becker, Jacob Mincer, Theodore Schultz and others continued to reject activist feminism in economics. Certainly it wasn't Jacob Mincer and Theodore Schultz didn't talk in this way, but Gary Becker certainly quite clearly rejected activist feminism in economics, drawing on sociobiological literature like that of Edward Wilson in his treatise on the family, Gary Becker's treatise on the family, to argue in favour of a gendered division of labour based on biological comparative advantage against the claims of the women's liberation movement. And we saw that Gary Becker was awarded the Nobel Prize for this work that he produced across the 1980s, really rejecting in its effects, rejecting the claims of the women's movement and sexual liberation movements. We saw that this work was actually rewarded with a Nobel Prize in economics in 1992. At this stage, there really was no such thing as feminism in the discipline of economics, although certainly in economic thought beyond that disciplinary confines, there was a considerable exploration of this, the importance of feminist perspectives. And so in stage 3 of my potted history of feminism in economic thinking that I provided to you in the week on feminist economics, in stage 3, we really saw just how much effort it took to force change to come to economics and how belated that change was in comparison with other disciplines. The introduction of feminism to the discipline of economics suddenly forced economists to orient themselves around important social objectives like gender equality. And that didn't happen without an enormous activist work within people working in economics, in the discipline itself, to force that change. And we looked at some of the strategies that feminist economists use to do that, beginning in part with navel-gazing studies that studied the marginalisation of topics within economics, labour, market economics and its studies of women's labour, and other topics that were struggled to find a foothold and to be recognised as viable, valuable economic thought. We also saw studies trying to tackle inequalities, gendered inequalities, and map those out empirically in economies, equity studies. And we saw new methodologies emerging that were no longer just concerned with equity, but about valuing the different sorts of contributions that women may make to economic life. So a kind of equity feminism and a difference feminism. And we saw that the early founders of feminist economics had to be quite creative in trying to create institutions that would recognize the value of their work within the discipline of economics itself, creating new organizations like IAFE, the International Association for Feminist Economics, which is still very active and very important institution, an increasingly diverse institution today, and the foundation of a journal, Feminist Economics, where this work could actually be published and recognized as economics. We saw the introduction of new categories, JEL categories, journal for economic literature categories, JEL categories for publishing this work as well. And these were the sorts of institutional changes that were necessary to allow recognition of work that previously had not counted within the discipline of economics. So that's a summary, if you like, of the work that we did in the earlier week on feminist economics, showing what the feminist economists managed to achieve in the late 1980s and early 1990s through these creative efforts. However, from the mid-1990s, one economic thinker, Lee Badgett, published several articles arguing that there had been very little consideration by feminist family economists of gender-based injustices experienced by LGBTIQ plus families. And yet, as Badgett argued, these same families, LGBT plus people, face a heightened risk of poverty, homelessness, risk of imprisonment, experiences of physical and mental ill health, gender-based violence, suicide and self-harm associated with inequalities in education, income, healthcare, domestic partner benefits, access to IVF, employment-based insurance and participation in public life. So Lee Badgett in the mid-1980s really was the first economist within the discipline to try to bring what she called a friendly criticism to the feminist founders of economics, to show how the categories that had been employed by early disciplinary feminist economists had clouded certain injustices from view. Note that Lee Badgett limits her study to what she calls LGBT plus because she thinks that the adjective queer is an umbrella term that captures LGBT plus, and because she does not think that there's enough data existing on intersex and asexual to permit their effective study. So it's not that she doesn't want to include them in the work that she's presenting more recently in her book on LGBT plus or queer economics, but she feels that the data is lacking to be able to say very much about the injustices or experiences, populations, etc., about these people who would fall in or be accept the category of being intersex or asexual. According to Badgett, the lack of consideration of problems faced by queer people was due in large part to how feminist economists initially conceptualized the objectives of their work in terms of overcoming socially constructed gendered injustices. Of course, it wasn't just feminist economists who did this, but because feminist economists had been the very first to bring belatedly to the discipline changes to how economics was done and conceptualising their work as contributing to objectives of securing gendered equalities, Badgett felt that the way in which feminist economists had conceptualised their objectives had allowed these other experiences to remain invisible. And Badgett was able to see this, in my view, due to her openness to literature from the humanities that her economist colleagues were not familiar with. And you'll see that she refers to Colleen Lamos, who was working in cultural studies and in English and in literature, where feminism was not just liberal forms of gender feminism, but influenced, as we'll see shortly, by European philosophy and the way analyses of the culturally constructed nature of the very categories that we're using to identify people. So because Badgett was open to sources and texts and ideas from well beyond those that her economics colleagues were familiar with, she, in my view, saw exclusions that her colleagues in feminist economics had not noticed prior to this. So, how did these early disciplinary feminist economists who pioneered important social change within the discipline of economics itself, how did they think about sex and gender? We'll do this work first, and then we'll consider why Lee Badgett, drawing on other sources and other sorts of texts in philosophy, European philosophy and elsewhere, became critical of these categories. So let's do the work first and then turn to the criticism. When pressed to think theoretically, key founders of feminist economics like Julie Nelson, Marion Ferber, and others define the objective as the modification of the social construction of gender, using categories from what we refer to as second wave gender feminism. As I said in the week on feminist economics several weeks ago, those waves and their distinction are less than clear, but this is often the way in which thought is categorized and in those waves of feminism. So the key founders, when pressed, defined their objectives as the modification of the social construction of gender. As Julie Nelson explained in the new Palgrave Dictionary of Economics in as late as 2008, a key distinction feminist economists make is between sex, understood as the biological difference between males and females, and gender, the social beliefs that society constructs on the basis of sex. And this sex-gender distinction, employed by gender feminists, according to Ferber and Nelson, quote, probably provides the best basis for a dialogue between feminist theory and economics. And how did they view these categories? Well, as mentioned, they viewed sex differences as the biological difference between males and females. And they viewed gender differences as purportedly constructed on top of those binary differences. And the gender differences were then conceptualized as dimorphic and biological. Dimorphic means based on the morphology of the body, and binary and biological. This is equivalent to a conception of a brute difference between male and female bodies at birth. And for the feminist economists of the late 1980s and 1990s, gender differences were conceptualized as a social construction of that brute biological difference. The social norms and values that societies ascribed to this purportedly brute fact of a given body. As Ferber and Nelson together explained, quote, "Gender is the social meaning given to biological differences between the sexes. It refers to cultural constructs rather than to biological givens." So we can see they're using this biological difference between sex to then talk about how gender is constructed, purportedly constructed on top of that, reflected then a binary difference based on this biological difference. So gender's conceptualized along a binary divide as the socially constructed cultural meaning of dimorphic biological sex difference. Although Ferber and Nelson were critical of the use of binary concepts in other contexts, they were critical of the difference between productive labour and unproductive labour, because women's work in the house had been viewed as unproductive by both neoclassical and Marxist economists, as opposed to the productive work outside the home. And although Ferber and Nelson were also critical of this distinction between public and private too, and they were critical too of other binary concepts and their use in economics, they didn't go so far as to criticise the use of binary concepts with respect to sex or with respect to gender. And this is because those differences were useful to them in their perceived objectives. They wanted to shoulder the objective of overcoming unjust gendered inequalities. And it was useful for them to conceptualise gender as the socially constructed meaning of biological difference, which had enabled injustice. And then the objective could be circumscribed for them as trying to overcome gender, to try and overcome those differences between genders that their work showed to have produced inequalities. They wanted to try and create societies that were gender neutral, that didn't have those gendered differences in them anymore, since these were conceptualized as socially constructed. And so, as we saw in the week on feminist economics, this was very useful to them. It enabled them to study differences between women and men and their economic outcomes as defined by their theories, and call for changes and study the effect of policies to see whether or not they were able to overcome gendered inequalities in economic outcomes. So these categories were very useful to them in the late 1980s and 1990s in allowing visibility for injustices that hadn't been perceived as injustices prior to that, with the Nobel Prize being awarded to Gary Becker for work that suggested that women were likely to, as defined by the theory, women were likely to choose voluntarily to work in the home because they had a comparative advantage in the having of children. So quite naturally, feminist economists wanted to criticise that, and they mobilised categories that were useful to them in this regard, allowing inequalities that hadn't been recognised as injustices to be viewed as injustices. However, from the mid-1990s onwards, Lee Badgett was really a crucial figure in the discipline of feminist economics, because she argued that categories of binary sexual difference and binary constructed gender employed by the early founders of feminist economics had prevented other injustices from being recognised. So Lee Badgett drew on an interdisciplinary literature spanning European philosophy, cultural studies, gender studies, legal studies, literary studies, and even biological anthropology. This literature allows two problems to be raised. A first problem was that the concept of a pre-cultural, dimorphic, natural, biological difference between women and men was itself a construct of social practices that had positioned and categorized the diverse materiality of bodies in this way. One of the key thinkers in America, in the United States of America, who developed this idea, this theory, was Judith Butler, who drew on Foucault, Derrida, Althusser, and other contemporary European French philosophers to argue that the natural, what appeared as natural, was itself in effect constructed through the social. The claim was made that although biological differences certainly exist, yes, of course they do, the difference between male and female bodies would still be better categorized along a spectrum rather than in the socially constructed and broadly accepted terms of a dimorphic binary, which did not map easily onto unruly bodies who had been overlooked by the categories that had been employed. And a second problem was that the concept of a binary man-woman gender constructed around or on top of these purportedly essential biological differences was also difficult to apply to the experiences of people whose sexual orientation or gender identification differed with the way their biological body had been described by medical experts. And so Lee Badgett, in the 1990s and about 1995 onwards, began to work within feminist economics to try to show her feminist colleagues and friends that the injustices faced by rainbow families were not easily visible to the feminist economists because they'd mostly conceptualized their objective as changing the social construction of gender that had left biological females, defined by the feminist economists as women, experiencing inequalities or injustices at the hands of biological males, defined by feminist economist founders as men. And again, we can see how useful this work was and still is, given the continued existence of these forms of inequalities and injustices. But Badgett's call was, well, we need to still ensure that this doesn't prevent visibility to other more marginal forms of injustice or inequality, inequalities that we'd like to see as injustices. There's no reason why we can't do both. Be concerned for women as the feminist economists define them, and also be concerned for the unruly bodies and the people who are identified quite differently in terms of their gender identification, and whose experiences and the injustices faced didn't map onto the way that feminist economists were studying families. So who were the key feminist economists who brought this friendly criticism, as Badgett calls it, to their feminist colleagues from the mid-1990s onwards? Well, there were people like Rhonda Williams. In Australia, we saw Gillian Hewitson, who actually studied at La Trobe under a fantastic heterodox economist called John King. We saw Drucilla and Edith Kuiper working in the philosophy of economics. Kuiper's still writing today and has published just recently in 2022 Her Story of Economics. And we also, as I've just said on previous slides, saw the work of Lee Badgett. Lee Badgett was definitely the most influential feminist economist who brought this friendly criticism to the discipline. In 1993, economist Rhonda Williams explained how gender theorists informed by European or French philosophy were, quote, continuing to critique the incompleteness of analytical and political projects that employ women as an already constituted and undifferentiated group, and gender as a stable social and symbolic category. As for Hewitson, in an early PhD in 1998 and book 1999 that reviewed and analysed the concepts and methodologies employed by 1990s feminist economists, the economist Gillian Hewitson considered the difference between conceptions of sex and gender in feminist economics on one hand and in post-structural feminism on the other. And again, in my view, it was because of Hewitson's attention to competing interpretations of feminism that Hewitson was able to notice this. Drawing on the work of post-structuralist philosophers, as well as Australian feminist philosopher Moira Gatens, Hewitson explained how this literature allowed one to acknowledge that, quote, sexed bodies are products of culture, its discourses and institutional forms, and hence sexed bodies are not natural, if by natural one means beyond culture. So even the body, the brute biology of a body, which the feminist founders of feminist economics were viewing as natural and biological, even that would be better viewed, Hewitson claims, as a culturally constructed way of thinking about the natural. And Hewitson drew on US literary studies and cultural studies academics like Jardine and Moy. I'm not sure how to say that, to be honest. Citing Gatens, Hewitson asked the feminist economist to accept that to speak of a body as somehow being outside of culture and its influences is nonsensical. Already to speak right about the body, even the biological body, is to subject it to language, itself a cultural product. Citing gender theorist and philosopher Judith Butler, Hewitson explained that gender is not to culture as sex is to nature. Gender is also the discursive cultural means by which sexed nature or a natural sex is produced and established as pre-discursive. So the very idea of the brute biological body as pre-discursive is itself produced in a discourse. There is no recourse to a body that has not already been interpreted by cultural meanings, claims Judith Butler. Now, philosophers of economics like Drucilla Barker and Edith Kuiper were quick to support the significance of this for the categories of feminism, for the categories that were employed by the founding feminist economists. And they were very sympathetic to the feminist economists for trying to mobilise these concepts in a context of immense disciplinary resistance. As we noted, economics was the arrival of feminism to economics was belated and really resisted, more so than in other disciplines. And so this really was a friendly criticism intended to both support disciplinary feminist economics, but also encourage a way of thinking about the sex-gender binary that would not itself reinstate blindnesses to other forms of injustice. So even if the sex-gender binary had allowed feminist economists to define their objective as overcoming gendered injustices between women and men, and even if this was very important, it was important to bring this to economics. Drucilla Barker and Edith Kuiper were drawing on post-structuralist feminism to call into question the very possibility of such concepts and to encourage their feminist colleagues to be doing their work, their important work, in a manner that would not necessarily produce, again, a blindness to other forms of inequality that had not yet been thematized or depicted or positioned as injustice. As for Lee Badgett, in bridge-building spirit, Badgett asked her feminist colleagues to expand the defining categories of feminist family economics to include categories of sexual orientation. And not just sexual orientation, but also gender identification, so as to permit consideration of the marginalisation of queer families. Badgett claimed that broader concerns were already implicit in the early formulations of the subdiscipline and would benefit from being made explicit. As Nancy Folbra had already acknowledged, quote, "The real contribution of feminist theory lies in its efforts to reconceptualise the relationship between different forms of social inequality, rather than simply to empower women." And Badgett quotes Nancy Folbra on this point. For Lee Badgett, social reproduction had very many different dimensions beyond biological sex differences, including gender identification in its diversity, age, sexual orientation, race, class, and nation. The otherwise valuable work of feminist economists would benefit, Badgett argued, from acknowledging the implications of Folbra's acknowledgement that groups always act within, quote, structures of constraint, with equality pursued across divided loyalties and competing interests. This was quite remarkable that this occurred as early as it did in economics. Presciently, in as early as 1995, Badgett even challenged her colleagues to consider the overlooked question of whether the oppression of transgendered and transsexual people should be addressed in a civil rights bill to prohibit sexual orientation discrimination. Although certainly we see an emphasis on sexual orientation discrimination, Badgett does, in a 1997 text, go beyond to talk about the importance of gender identification categories. So Badgett notes how the question of the oppression of transgendered and transsexual people and whether it should be addressed in a civil rights bill should, quote, jolt those of you who take comfort in the apparently fixed biological basis of at least one social and legal category, sex. Now Badgett drew heavily here on the work of Weston. Weston was a sociologist who had conducted fieldwork with lesbian, gay and bisexual families in the San Francisco area across the early 1990s. And Badgett proposed making space within feminist economics for studies of the families we choose. These families were not exhausted by legally sanctioned relationships of marriage, blood or legal consent. According to Weston's sociological analysis of existing families in the Bay Area, these were chosen families, comprised of heterogeneous kinship networks with fluid boundaries. The families were multi-household and complex, comprised of chosen people who modelled and supported possibilities and needs. As Badgett explained, and I really love this quote, one of the best things for me about striking out into an area largely untouched by economists, studying the economic lives of gay women and gay men, and now gender diverse lives, we could say as well, has been that I've had to look to our sister social sciences and even the humanities about where and how to start. And like many economists who have reached out across the disciplines over the last decades, I found an enormous canyon separating most economists from the postmodern theoretical discussions taking place in sociology, in anthropology, in history, in women's studies, in gender studies, in English and comparative literature. And Badgett continues, to me, it's an intimidating divide that I'm inching across, learning a new theoretical vocabulary and moving on to tough theoretical and empirical questions. What does the deconstruction of categories like race, sex, gender, and sexual orientation mean in the context of economic theory? How can I run regressions without categorizing people by their race or their sex? And that's quite striking because, of course, economists need these categories, right? They need to categorize people in order to be able to study them, and so forth. So we'll turn to the methodologies used in a moment. Lee Badgett also recognised that she herself would need to remain attentive to potential exclusions in her own work. Well, we all need to do this over the course of our lives, but it's certainly rare to find scholars who explicitly acknowledge it. When challenged by a colleague and researcher in English at Rice University, Colleen Lamos, Badgett accepted that even she herself, Badgett, had essentialised gay, lesbian and bisexual identities in her own work. For example, although she'd worked hard to support the introduction of categories like sexual orientation into US censuses and into other empirical population studies, she accepted that certainly this category remained important for accessing certain forms of injustice, but it did not map onto other forms of identification in LGBT plus queer communities. She noted how categories of sexual orientation really defined people in terms of who they are attracted to and not how they identify. She explicitly acknowledged a need to resist the temptation to seek refuge with, quote, the remaining psychologists, sociologists and political scientists, among others, who share the economist's faith in the scientific discovery of the laws of human behaviour and in the unchanging essence of what it means to be black or a woman or a lesbian. Acknowledging, quote, just how hard it is to live in a postmodern world, Badgett called on her academic colleagues to commit to, quote, participating in the larger intellectual life around us and talking to people who have been grappling with these difficult but compelling issues for years. So now that we've mapped out the problem that the queer economists attempted to shoulder, and I should say I've been referring to queer economists, but at this stage there really weren't many. It really wasn't like it was that much in the plural. Lee Badgett was really critical and instrumental in the 1990s, receiving support from only a small handful of economists, at least it seems to me in reading back over the literature. So how did these queer economists respond? We're going to look at Lee Badgett's work primarily here. So there's four key elements of Badgett's methodology: strategic essentialism, attention to exclusion, deference to activism, and identification of actionable research priorities. So the first aspect of the methodology, the first key element, is a commitment to strategic essentialism. I came across this myself in my own undergraduate studies a long time ago now, when I studied the work of Gayatri Chakravorty-Spivak, who was a post-colonial theorist from India, who had also spoken about why, in the context of destabilizing identity categories, it was still useful to use strategically defined categories to study particular injustices. For her, in the context of poor Bangladeshi families trying to speak to the World Bank about the importance of flooding for their livelihoods. So it was interesting for me to see Badgett using this strategy explicitly herself as central to her methodology. For Badgett, distinctions do need to be made so that inequalities can be studied. Survey instruments and empirical research projects do require distinctions. We wouldn't be able to study anything otherwise. But the challenge is to, quote, construct survey instruments or empirical research projects without defining and restabilizing categories. So we need to acknowledge that this is done for strategic purposes to combat particular injustices. This definitional work must, according to Badgett, reflect emerging identifications, even when these remain contestable in principle and also contested. So in the mid-1990s, Badgett was instrumental in defending the need for new categories of sexual orientation on surveys. And later, she advocated for categories of gender identification. Now, this is a live debate in Australia where the categories of gender identification were recently removed from the proposal for more inclusive categories to be used in the census. And with an ensuing debate about this, about the importance of having gender identification categories in the Australian survey, in the Australian census. Badgett felt that categories should permit attention both to inequalities in access to rights and opportunities and to the challenge of attenuating known associated risks of poverty, homelessness, ill health, violence, suicide and self-harm. Since dimorphic sex categories are still commonly used in the social world to describe bodies, and since these categories inform how many people still understand their own sexual orientation, Badgett defended the concept of sexual orientation as useful for allowing identification of inequalities between and within families. And certainly this use of strategic essentialism has permitted empirical studies of differences that exist across families of gay, lesbian, bisexual and heterosexual orientation, where the issue is where identities are defined here in terms of who one is sexually attracted to, and not in terms of how one identifies in terms of one's gender. So sexual orientation has permitted access to differences across variables that include education, income, practices of dividing household market labour, fertility, and a whole and many more indices. As for attention to exclusion across social change, Badgett claims that the design of surveys should feature how people define themselves, a commitment that requires attention to change, social change. Identity labels will continue to evolve over time. Indeed, as mentioned early on, Badgett accepted that her own preferred category of sexual orientation similarly wielded the power to exclude and alienate in a political context. And this was something that her colleague Colleen Lamos had helped her to see. It prioritised who one desires rather than how one identified. Consequently, by 1997, Badgett had accepted the terms that people prefer to use to describe themselves, including genderqueer, non-binary, third gender, transfeminine, transmasculine, and trans. In recent surveys, she's added descriptors like, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, hijra for male assigned persons who identify as third gender in India, and another term, warrior, for some transfeminine women in Indonesia. This work led Badgett to advocate for inclusion of categories reflecting diverse identifications in US surveys to permit access to a range of new empirical data on the behaviour and characteristics of diverse families, including their demographic characteristics, their education, their health, employment and income, marital status, presence of children, and partnership dynamics. So the third element of Lee Badgett's methodology is deference to activism. Let's take a case where there's two objectives that lie in tension. There's an equity objective involving a commitment to overcoming inequalities in opportunity, outcome that reflect direct or indirect discrimination in the workplace, healthcare, community organisations, religious life, and so on. And so according to this equity objective, the idea is to ensure that these institutions offer access to people of different sexual orientation or gender identification. But there might also be a diversity objective, which values heterogeneity and fluidity, the fluidity of, quote, the families we choose. And these objectives of equity and diversity might actually come into conflict with each other. And this is reflected in some of the literature around the equality in marriage developments. So beyond economics, this tension is reflected in discussions about the potential for same-sex marriage equality to potentially undermine heterogeneous relationship structures. So I've provided you with some references. Some, for example, have worried about extending a patriarchal system to lesbian relationships. Others have interpreted marriage itself as an institution, as an undesirable, quote, technology of social control. Several queer theorists have argued that same-sex marriage is an attempt to domesticate public sex in public, and to undermine other non-normative sexual practices that they enjoy in their communities. Still more have argued that same-sex marriage equality is less of a priority than marriage equality, extending to the many numerous sexual and relationship arrangements that exist in rainbow communities. And so we've got this tension between equity objectives and diversity objectives, where the fear is among some community members that achieving equality in marriage, for example, might undermine the diversity that communities have enjoy. With Colleen Lamos, Badgett describes this dual commitment to equality and heterogeneity as a catch-22. When heterogeneous families gain social acceptance through extensions of equality in the form of benefits enjoyed by heterosexual families, then some of the distinct and valuable characteristics of heterogeneous relationships, like non-normative sexual practices, plurality in sexual and relational arrangements and the like, may dissolve, with lives increasingly organised around heterosexual norms. So this is the way that institutions might then have a domesticating effect on heterogeneity. Now, Lee Badgett accepts this diagnosis, but she recommends deferring to the position of activists who appear to have garnered community support. And she says, well, if there are really high levels of support for same-sex marriage equality, then instead of blindly seeking equalities without regard for the effects on heterogeneity, let's conceptualize the work that needs to be done as supporting political efforts of activists. If activists lay stake to a need for these new forms of legal and material recognition, they should have information about the likely effects of legal and political changes on their chosen families. And that's how Badgett conceptualizes her work. She undertakes both qualitative and quantitative studies of the effects of achieving marriage equality in different locations beyond the US, where those changes had already taken place. So in the Netherlands. And she did this to provide information about whether the legal and political changes were likely to undermine or support the heterogeneity of chosen families. And her findings are that marriage actually does change people more than gay people change marriage. So the institution of marriage does change gay partnerships, gay families, etc., more than gay people actually then change the institution of marriage. So there is an element there, she says, of the qualitative, quantitative findings that does show that access to institutional marriage does undermine heterogeneity. But she also finds that most gay couples actually like it. They want this. They're happy. They want the substantial benefits that also then flow on from legal, social and political changes. The benefits that flow on from what the institution of marriage offers. And she feels like she maps out, yeah, those changes have occurred, but actually people have for the most part been happy with that. And once activists have that information at their disposition, they're more likely then to be able to make good judgments about whether or not it's a sacrifice worth taking for the benefits. So it's a kind of interesting approach. So let's briefly consider on this topic of deference to activism again some potential problems here, because it's not really straightforward to me as to who the activists are according to Badgett. Note that Badgett's concern with the value of heterogeneity is different from the concerns of black activists and legal scholars who have instead argued that same-sex marriage promises merely to secure improvements for white middle-class gays and lesbians who'd largely benefit from same-sex marriage. I've provided you with some references there. Some have claimed that black queer people require real and systemic normative change to ensure their safety. So Badgett's work is really mostly concerned with the effects of equal marriage rights on heterogeneity, and less with the question of what non-white queer people might need in comparison to white queer people. Again, we can see how the definition of the problem has an impact upon how it's studied then. And there are maybe other problems with this view too. Should we always be deferring to activists, and which ones to defer to? Some activists speak more loudly, but their views might not be representative. An alternative approach might be that of, instead of deferring to activists, to engage qualitative research and quantitative research with a large number of rainbow families, rainbow people, to gauge community views on these catch-22 problems, like the advocacy for equality in marriage. And the final key element of Lee Badgett's methodology is the identification of actionable research priorities. These are primarily focused on measurements of inclusion, quantitative measurements of inclusion across a range of areas: health, income, poverty, non-discrimination in employment, gender-based violence, education, and political and civil participation. And note how really it's impossible to study these without the introduction of categories into the census and into actual other survey instruments that allow this to be studied, hence the reason for strategic essentialism as the first key element. In addition to measures of inclusion, Badgett has identified further high priority focus areas designed to secure much needed information, including LGBTIQA+ population estimates. Note that in her 2021 co-authored book, as I mentioned earlier, she doesn't deal with I and A, and Q is in effect the same as LGBT+. And the reason she doesn't deal with I and A is because there is very little information about these categories, so she cannot say very much about them. Also, measures of public opinion and stigma, relationship between rights, inclusion and economic growth, impacts of laws, policies and programs, the evaluation of policies, prevailing gender norms, impact and prevalence of conversion therapies is a research priority, patterns in migration and forced movement, and research to develop new methods and surveys. And so she thinks that if you identify these research priorities, then you can actually get to work in trying to study them in effective ways, and only then will you have a good sense of the existing state of affairs and the likely effects of different possible programs to overcome the problems that your research has identified. Let's turn briefly to critical considerations. This is the third part of the lecture, and we go to critical consideration of our theories each week. So as we do each week, let's consider who wins, who loses, and does it matter? So any form of strategic essentialism involves its own exclusions. We've seen that Badgett has explicitly accepted that this is the case of her own approach. And she's unusual in that regard to explicitly acknowledge that this is happening and yet nonetheless continue to commit to doing so for strategic ends. Our subject here, competing approaches to political economy, how societies and economies interact, has shown in each week, whether we're looking at Keynesian, post-Keynesian, neoclassical, classical, Marxian economics, whatever topic we've been looking at, Austrian neoliberal economics, we've shown each week that there are always people who benefit disproportionately from how particular methodologies target quite specific problems. So we've seen that theory is not neutral. Methodology is chosen in response to particular problems that the economists perceive a need to shoulder in different time periods. And queer economics, queer political economy is no different in that regard. We've seen Badgett is quite unusual in explicitly acknowledging that to be the case. So certainly an eye to injustices that could not appear as such would benefit those who endured them. So we know who's going to benefit. There's very little consideration by feminist economists of gender-based injustices experienced by LGBTIQ+ families. And yet we know through research that LGBT+ people, the increasing research that's been done, face a heightened risk of poverty, homelessness, risk of imprisonment, experiences of physical and mental ill health, gender-based violence, suicide, and self-harm. And these are associated, research has now shown increasingly in recent years, these are associated with inequalities in education, income, healthcare, domestic partner benefits, access to IVF, employment-based insurance and participation in public life. And so if we're concerned about justice, then we know that this sort of approach is going to be helpful in trying to remedy those injustices. But what of those who might miss out? As mentioned on the previous slide, Badgett's effort to allow activists who appear to have the most community support may mean that some less visible problems in the margins of marginal communities might then be invisible. A tension reflected in concerns raised beyond economics about the potential for same-sex marriage equality to potentially undermine heterogeneous relationship structures was also noted on the previous slide. We saw how some have worried about extending a patriarchal system to lesbian relationships through equal marriage, with marriage viewed as a technology of social control. So we can say that those who miss out may very well be those who were on the margins of marginal communities as well. Doesn't matter? Well, certainly it matters to those whose families are not visible to legal and according to the legal structures and categories that we use to describe and identify and analyze and study people. This shows again, and this is a major theme of our subject, how the way that we construct our problems and design our methodologies is not a neutral exercise. But certainly an eye to injustices that we haven't noticed or studied before seems to be a useful endeavour. It seems that Mark Blaug, a key and very well-known methodologist in economics, who studies the methodologies of economics, is wrong to think that it is possible for a science, for a science of economics that bases itself uniquely on methodological values to exist. Mark Blaug thinks that we can distinguish quite easily between values that are meant to be founding values that allow a methodology to begin, as opposed to values that are ethical and have regard to who gets what. But in our subject, by taking a historical approach, we've tried to show that the very selection of methodological values has had an impact upon the question of who gets what. It's not easy to separate those off in the way that Mark Blaug has argued. For a criticism of Blaug's account of Pareto economics and new welfare economics, see John B. Davis and Wade Hands, who argue that even the avoidance of interpersonal comparisons of utility had a particular role in preventing comparisons of the value of $1 in the hands of a poor person as opposed to a rich person, which itself was a political judgment, an ethical judgment. So it seems that the way in which we construct our problems and design our methodologies is not neutral. So there will be those who miss out, and there will be people who benefit from new methodologies. And the challenge then is to be responsive to new problems as they emerge, or to hidden problems that we didn't notice before. And that's basically it. It's been quite a long lecture again, but I hope you found it useful to think about how the Lee Badgett defined the problem and the sorts of approaches that she employed in developing new methodologies to explore this problem. Here are some selected references. Actually, these are the references that I refer to in the lecture. So if you would like to follow on in your reading, this is a list, a great list of where you could go to from here. Thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts in tutorials.